Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. You're welcome to another Legacy Academic webinar. Please, ground rules still remain the same. All mics be muted. To conserve our energy and to conserve our bandwidth, kindly ensure that your cameras are also in non-viewing status. Having said that, I yield. Please, all mics be muted. That is our number one ground rules. I yield to you, Mr. Abioye. I'll take care of the mics.
Okay.
So when I
Good,
it's not fair.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight, part of our Legacy 1995 academic webinar series. And thank you. We have Professor Gerard Twin with us tonight, who will be taking us through his research and his research, which combines oral archival materials, archaeological findings to explore monumental artwork, urbanization, and social transformation in pre-modern West Africa. Thank you so much, Prof, for being here with us. But first and foremost, I would like to invite Mr. Taye Olaniyi, the president of Legacy, for a formal welcome with us, and for a welcome address to us all. So, Mr. Taye Olaniyi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I heartily want to welcome on behalf of Legacy 1995, the Historical and Environmental Interest Group, all of us that are participating today in this webinar. We are honored to have in our midst Professor Geracho, who I know that based on what I will call his medulla oblongata, he has a lot to tell us about Ife. According to a Swiss historian, history is that subject where it is difficult to begin from the beginning. And as you have rightly said, that we are going to get information on the history, on the oral tradition, and archaeological findings of the artifacts that project Ife as what we Yorubas normally call the cradle of human civilization. Legacy always, as the name depicts, is always after what is man in his biotic and abiotic environment, and what are the footprints that man has been able to achieve in time past, what is it currently, and what should be projected into the future. These aspects of scientific, historical, and environmental findings relating to Ife in history, in heritage of the past, we are honored to have Professor Gerard with us, and I pray that at the end of the day, we will appreciate him for the intellectual charity that is going to expose us all to. So I want to welcome you and welcome everybody that is on this webinar, that let us see how we pride in all these aspects of advancing the cause of educational milieu. So thank you very much. I think the ball is in your court now to further introduce him, and then let's fire on from this beginning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Olaniyi. Now, the agenda for tonight will be, one, the president's address, which he has just so graciously given us. The next will be the professor's lecture. Afterwards will be a question and answer session. Open, everybody can have the question. And even as he's giving his lecture, you can be typing the lectures in the chat room. Myself, Abioye Ayeni, that is my name, with Adebumi Akimbo and Oli Owen, who will anchor the question and answer session we are together, we are all together in anchoring this event. Now, for us to, as we wait for the main event, let me introduce Dr. Gerald Choing. He's an associate professor of African history at William and Mary, Virginia, USA, and co-director of Ife Shumo Archaeological Project in Southwest Nigeria. He's currently on sabbatical leave in Ghana, working as a heritage expert with the Ghana Museums and Monument Board. So all the way from Accra, Ghana, Professor Choing, thank you so much. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. And let me express my gratitude for this invitation. I think it's really important for us to share, some of our findings with the general public and with people who have a passion for the heritage. So thank you so much for inviting me. I would like to say that of course, I'm an historian, but I don't work alone. The Ife Shumbo Archaeological Project is every year about 40 participants. And of course, I co-created this organization with Adisa Ogunfolakan, my dear friend. Professor Ogunfolakan is now retired from Ile-Ife, from OAU, but it's been a pillar of this project. This being said, all what I'm going to share with you today is, let's say, my own voice, all right? Sometimes, I mean, this is history, right? Nothing is final in history. And so I'm going to talk about the way I look at this history and the way I try to solve some mysteries in this history. It doesn't mean that this is a final history, all right? This is work in progress. This is a history full of hypotheses and excitement. Couple of things here. I'm going to talk mostly about what I call medieval Ife, which is a reference to Ife before 1400. But of course, the history of Ife, keeps being discussed and refined. And also, of course, the history of Ife remains also an object of politics, which is the reason why in the subtitle, I talk about it from the 10th century to today, right? So I tried to put together some slides. My presentation is a little bit long, but this African history is never simple and is always complex. And I want to kind of give you also a little sense of this complexity that we encounter as archaeologists. Let me see. Okay. So I would like to start with this general map, right? I'm going to talk here a lot about Ife being connected to the rest of the medieval world, all right? Let's look at this map. This is a kind of a map that was developed quite recently by a student at a university in Sweden, which for the first time, right, takes Africa seriously as being connected with trade networks in the medieval world. I would say this map is very, very insufficient, but for the first time, Ile-Ife actually appears on this map as being connected to the worldwide medieval trade system, which is, I think, something really interesting that we are going to discuss today. Africa is no more this continent isolated before the colonial period, all right? We all know that, yet, if we look at the material that we share to our students it's rarely actually updated. And so I would like to start with this map, which for the first time shows Ife connected to a worldwide network of trade. Of course, this is derived from what historians have called the world system theory. And during the last 2 decades of archaeological research in Africa, there's been a lot of progress to integrate the continent into this kind of global perspective. And you can see here on different maps, one from 1989, where only the eastern part of Africa and the Horn of Africa is included in this kind of global perspective, to this one in 2011, where we can see part of West Africa becoming part of this global perspective. And then more recently, even, Africa every time becomes more integrated to this perspective, this global perspective. And that's important for what I'm going to try to say today. I would like to start with a book by Bruce Campbell, which is called The Great Transition, dated 2016. First of all, let's say that this book has a problem, which is that it talks about the world, it talks about Europe, it talks about Asia, it doesn't talk about Africa. Africa is totally absent from this book. And it's such a pity because this book is a really interesting way of doing history, which brings together ecology, biology, society, climate, and so on. And the book also, I think, is quite important in building together a chronology of what happened at the end of the medieval period. And in the Great Transition scenario, the world goes through a transition in the 13th and 14th century. And there is a first kind of period between 1260 to the 1330s, where there is a gradual perfect storm coming into place. Civilizations are at their peak, but there is a longing crisis, which is a biological crisis, which is an environmental crisis, which ends with the crisis of the 14th century, what the Italians call la crisi del Trecento, which is this period, 1330 to 1370s, where there is a major societal crash in different parts of the world, leading to a demographic crisis. And this oftentimes is looked at signing the end of the medieval world and opening the door to the next step, which is the modern world. After the 1370s, societies slowly recover, but they are transformed. And of course, one of the main one of the main events that is taking place during this crisis is what historians of the Western world have called the Black Death, all right, which is the second plague pandemic, which has been discussed in details, but never for Africa. So one of the questions that I'm going to kind of discuss, and which I'm discussing in my work, is, could this scenario be relevant for Africa? If we agree that Africa was well connected to the rest of the world, how would have Africa followed a different kind of process than the rest of the world? Why events that took place throughout the world, from Asia to Western, we are not talking about the Americas at that period of time, but from, let's say, the old world, right, from Europe to Asia, if Africa was very connected to this old world, does that mean that Africa might have actually also experienced the same kind of great transition. So let me go back to Ife now. And Ife, as you know, has a very, very deep history. But from a Western perspective, Ife really entered in Western imagination only quite late in the 1830s through the book of Richard and John Lander, who visit Old Oyo, the capital of the Oyo Empire. And at the market in Old Oyo, they are shown some fragments of what they do not recognize actually as glass crucibles. They recognize them as strange stones, which they are told that they are coming from where the first parents were created and from whence all Africa was people. This is what information they gather at Old Oyo in the 1830s. And actually, what we know now is that this little piece of strange stones were actually fragments of glass crucibles, which were made in old Ife to produce glass beads. And we know they come from Ife because it's only at Ife that they were produced. So that's how Ife enters into, as I said, the Western imagination and the Western literature. And of course, the next step will be the work by the German anthropologist Frobenius, and his publications, but also one very specific object, the Olokun head, which has become kind of a myth about the art of Ife, right? A prototype of perfection as old Ife produced during the medieval period. There is actually a very interesting article, which I put on the slide here, that you might want to read if you have time, which is a re-examination of the Olokun head, which was sometimes suggested to have been a copy, but which is now proven to be an original. Next, after Frobenius, so Frobenius is in Ife in 1910, and then in the 1940s, 1950s, you have the emergence of scientific archaeology at Ife, and there you have a rush of a variety of archaeologists, which are first European archaeologists, but rapidly train Nigerians into this discipline. And one of the most famous one for Ile-Ife is Frank Willett. Frank Willett actually excavated the site of Itayemu, which we are going to discuss today, because that's a site that our team have re-excavated after Frank Willett. But we also have Oliver Myers in Oduduwa College. We have a number of them: Bernard Fagg, Kenneth Murray, Peter Garlick, and of course Ekpo Eyo and Eluyemi Omotosho, which also worked in Ife. To such an extent that I often say Ile-Ife is the most excavated city in the whole of Africa. We are talking about dozens and dozens of archaeological excavations throughout the city. Yet, and this is something really interesting, at that period of time, archaeologists were mostly interested in recovering nice objects, not really interested in reconstructing the contexts in which these objects were born. And therefore, I'm sure that behind your screen, you can recognize some of the objects that I'm showing on this slide. They are very famous objects, terracottas and bronze objects, all coming from Itayemu. Yet you probably never read a publication on Itayemu, because Frank Willett did not publish any scientific article giving account of his archaeological work at Itayemu, or for that, and elsewhere, because Frank Willett led dozens of archaeological expeditions in Ife and around Ife during the 3-year period he spent at Ife. So we have a problem here. Oliver Meyers was also at Ife in 1966. He worked at the university at OAU for a short time and did some work at Oduduwa College. 1966, went back to the UK and died there, leaving all his work unpublished. Only Peter Garlick actually published in great details 2 sites which he excavated in the 1970s. So at the end of the day, we know a lot about Ife, we know a lot about the objects of Ife, but we know very little about the context that produced these objects. And this is the reason why with Adisa Ogunfolakan, we put our heads together and decided that no, we need to go back to Ife and we need to look in details, not at the artwork of Ife, but at Ife society, at what people living at Ife during this early period have left behind. Who were the people who created this art? That's really the questions that we have at heart in this project. I'm sure you recognize this beautiful terracotta, one of the most incredible terracotta that was found associated with a shrine at Itayemu, but by Frank Willett in 1957, 1958. Here it is. All right, so this is the modern picture of it. So I talked about the fact that a lot of the archaeology of Ife did not get published, but it wasn't lost for that matter. Oftentimes, the material, the records of these archaeologists still exist in the archives. And so one of the objectives of the Ife Shumbo archaeological project was actually to revisit the archaeology of Ife through the archival material left behind by archaeologists at Ife. And more particularly, we focused on Frank Willett, which left a huge amount of material which sits today in the archives of the University of Glasgow. So part of our work is to do new excavations at Ife, but also comparing it and try to reconstruct the work that was done by our predecessor. And here on the screen, you see an article that we published in 2022, which is a reconstruction of Frank Willett's excavation at Itayemu from 1957, and then one in 1962. There is still a lot that we have not yet published and reconstruct in terms of Frank Willett's archaeology. So now this is also a problem in terms of the narrative about Ife. I would say the academic narrative about Ife, because when you do not publish the detail of the archaeology, when you do not publish the details of the context where you found the objects, all what remains is the object, right? And the objects are looked at by art historians, not really by archaeologists or by historians, and therefore sometimes they tend to be disconnected with history. And I really like the work of Jacob Olupona, especially that book, The City of 201 Gods. And in that book, it talks about how the academic insight into Ife has been shallow. Not that there is a lack of scholarship, but because there is a lack of interdisciplinary engagement. And I would say especially a lack of engagement in the archaeology of Ife. And this focus on the objects, this focus on art rather than context and history is, let's say, the base of the classical story about Ife that we have all heard about, which need to be revisited. One narrative in particular, which really I find problematic, is this tendency to believe that the art of Ife is a witness kind of an enduring medieval culture, that what we witness today at Ife is directly connected with what we would have seen at Ife during the medieval period. And this is a problem because as historians, we know that there is history in Africa, all right? There is nothing medieval alive in Africa today, like there is nothing medieval alive in France or in Germany today. The medieval history is history. And therefore, we need to separate. We need to understand that history is dynamic, that we cannot look at Ife today as a kind of an open-air rendition of medieval Ife. So this is some of the site we excavated in the framework of the Ife Shumbo project. So the project started in 2015, and in 2025, we celebrated 10 years in the field. The mathematicians among you will say, well, from 2015 to 2025, there is actually 11 years, and you'll be correct. But then in 2021, because of the COVID, we couldn't organize excavations and fieldwork. And therefore, we have behind us 10 years of fieldwork at Ife. These are the different sites we excavated. Itayemu, which is a very interesting site because today it belongs to the federal government. It's an annex to the National Museum of Ife. And therefore, it's accessible with the blessing of the National Commission for Museum and Monuments, which is actually one of the partners of our project. Then we also started looking at Oduduwa College. Oduduwa College is very interesting, and usually schools are very interesting at Ife because they preserve quite some area which are not built, and therefore areas that are of interest to archaeologists because, of course, Ife is densely built, and it is difficult for us as archaeologists to come in the middle of this built environment to do our work. So we like to go to these places where there is still a lot of areas that have not been built, and Oduduwa College is one of these. And of course, we came back to Oduduwa College because of the work of Myers, also in 1966. We found interesting things. And At that time, we were interested in investigating some of the city walls of Ife. And of course, there is a city wall going through Itayemu. There is another city wall going through Oduduwa College. And actually, our next site was at Okeatan, where there is another city wall crossing the site. Then we moved to Lujumo, which is closer to the center. And Lujumo is actually the family compound of my colleague Adisa Ogunfolakan, which allowed for access to this place where we excavated, actually where Leah Roth excavated his family house where he grew up as a young man and discovered, a lot underneath this house. Then we moved last year, in 2024, we did some work at Lugbade and then also at Obalufon, Edunide. And these were, Edunide is a compound where until quite recently, people were making glass beads. And we wanted to compare this technology they were using in the 20th century at Edunide and compare it with what we know about the glass technology that existed at Ife during the medieval period. And of course, they are absolutely not connected, which is really interesting. So I gave you here a little summary of the work we did, but let's say that from 2015 to 2018, we were very, very much interested in the city walls of Ife, especially trying to understand how they developed and when they developed, right? And kind of reevaluate some key questions about Ife, which are key questions for archaeologists, like what's the stratigraphy like? What's the depositional history as we can see it in the archaeological record? What kind of ceramic are we seeing, which is a signature for the early period of Ife? And how different is it from the more modern ware we see at Ife? Then after 2019 and up to today, we focused more on extensive excavations of sites which we believe were urban sites, households, and trying to understand the urban context. We talk about Ile-Ife as a major medieval city. How was it organized? What kind of layouts are we talking about? How did people live? And then also, and very importantly, how was Ife connected to the rest of the world, as I started discussing at the beginning of this presentation? So I'm not going to tell you everything we did and we found at Ife because I would need much more than an hour to talk about that, but I'll give you some little clues about a certain number of things we did and we found. First of all, about connectedness. All right. This is an image of a very deep pit that we found at Ile-Ife. These ones are actually were excavated at Oduduwa College. And these are refuse pits, right? Very deep, more than 5 meters deep. They were used as toilet and they were used also for throwing refuse. And of course, they might have been used originally for extracting some materials, maybe some clay, maybe some other material that were extracted from this environment before becoming pits, trash pits. And on the top of, if you see my mouse here, in this context, we found wheat. That came really as a surprise because archaeologists had never found wheat in tropical Africa. For one good reason is that it's not a tropical plant. And therefore, the finding wheat grains in this context, which is dated from the 14th century, tells us about Ife being connected with areas where wheat grain were actually part of the foodways of people. And here we think more specifically about the Sahel, the closest place that we know of where we recovered wheat grains from medieval archaeological cities are in the Sahel and in the Sahara. So this implies that Ife was actually connected to some of these places and that some of these grains traveled. And of course, we know grain do not travel alone, right? So it tells us that there were exchanges between Ife and the Sahelian belt and maybe beyond. And so we published this article, which is online, which is accessible. You can all have a look at it if you are interested, where we discuss the early archaeological evidence of wheat and cotton from medieval Ile-Ife, because we also found a lot of cotton seeds from another context on the same site. Now, what we did not publish is other exotic plants from an Ife perspective, like chickpea, which were also recovered at Oduduwa College from the exact same context where we found wheat, or dates that were found at an even earlier context at Okeatan. These are obviously products that had traveled from what we call today the Sahel, the Sahelian region. And of course, we all know how the Sahelian region was connected through trans-Saharan trade to the Mediterranean world and to the rest of the world. So it makes a lot of sense that Ife was connected to this part of Africa because Ife was connected to the rest of the world. Now, why do we find wheat grain, right? And we have the largest collections of wheat grain in Africa today from Ile-Ife, which is a bit strange. Well, we don't know, maybe there was a small diaspora from Sahel who had settled at Ife for trade reasons. Or maybe wheat, because it was an exotic food, came in as an exotic food and out of curiosity, maybe for the wealthy to test and to consume. We do not know. But it is a marker of connectedness. Now, this I am very, very excited and proud to show you because this is what we have built in 2024 and 2025 at Itayemu on the top of what we call a pavement complex. And we are turning this place into an interpretation center for visitors to be able to see and appreciate what is left of the architecture of old Ife. Of course, you are going to tell me, oh, but I've seen this in my village, or I've seen this somewhere. Yes, they are everywhere because they are markers of urbanization connected with Ife throughout what is today southwestern Nigeria. They are markers of the influence of Ife over the whole region. But at Ife, They are especially dense, and they are worth conserving, and they are worth visiting for schools and for people to know about their heritage. So we built this roof over about 500 square meter of area, which we are now excavating. And some of these images there are showing you what we found, which is a superposition of pavements, some made of stone, some made of potsherd pavements, potsherd, broken pieces of potsherds, which is here. If you see my mouse on the screen, well, here you have a stone pavement, all right? All this is a stone pavement. This here is actually a scar made by a very recent foundation trench that was built a couple of years ago and which led to the discovery of this site. And here at the back, you see this building is actually a shelter for the first potsherd pavement that was excavated by Frank Willett in 1958. So this is the city of Ile-Ife. We do not understand it very well yet. We do not understand very well its architecture. We do not understand very well how it occupied the space, but we are busy trying to discover more about the way people organize their city. Of course, potsherd pavements and stone pavements are really interesting urban infrastructure because they form like a concrete floor, all right, which stops erosion. In a tropical city, erosion is a problem. Even in modern Nigeria, surface water, erosion are really important urban problems, as you all know, with potholes and the rest of it. And this is why people at Ife built this infrastructure, which was actually a way of controlling erosion and controlling surface water. So something that we can learn from. This is never seen anywhere because I just finished it a couple of days ago, which is a map of what you just saw, the center, this interpretation center we built. And you can see in blue, this is the stone pavement. And in the middle of this stone pavement, there was probably a ritual center here, which I call the temple here, with a shrine inside. But this shrine was abandoned at some point because under the weight of this pavement, the pavement actually caved in and people decided to fill it up and build new pavements, which are this one in yellow and this one in brown, which were made of potsherds, exactly like the one Willett excavated and which is protected under that small roof till today. So you can see how archaeology does work to try to retrieve how space was organized, how these pavements are connected one to the other, what kind of architecture are we talking about here? And there is still a lot that we don't know, and there is still a lot of ongoing work, for instance, to better understand what is going on in this part of Italy. So it's work in progress. Now, I told you that one of the really important questions that we had when we started this project was about the city walls, right? There'd been a tradition at Ife to believe that the city wall dated from the time of Old Ife, which would be medieval, right? And actually, our excavations, and this is an idea that you see copied and again and again and again and again from textbook to textbook in African history. This is actually an excerpt from the excellent book by my colleague Akin Ogundiran, who actually, I understand, came to present his work to your organization also. And I would say Akin was one of the first one to kind of be a bit critical about these early origins of walls at Ife. And if we look at his rendering of this map, you see that he actually understands that at least some of them were post-1500 century walls. Well, what we found in the framework of the Ife Shumbo project is that all the city walls that we see today are post 1500, and they are even fairly recent, let's say from the 18th century to as late as the 19th century. And for that purpose, we know about some of these because there is oral tradition about some of these. We even know which king actually, and we know where they and when they reigned. And we know that some of these are from the 19th century, yet the Western imagination, kind of took these maps and then compared them with medieval cities in Europe and decided that this was medieval, all right? So this is something that we have also been working on, and it brought us to kind of also reflect about the history of cities, all right? And to accept the fact that, well, maybe during this very early period, some of these cities were actually not surrounded by defensive walls, but were open metropolis. And when you think of that, there are many examples actually in Africa of major open metropolis. And I am here in Ghana, I can tell you about Kumasi, right? The capital of Ashanti, never had defensive walls, right? Why? Because from an Ashanti perspective, who would dare attacking Kumasi? Kumasi did not need any walls because its reputation was enough to defend itself. So, once again, kind of change a little bit the narrative of what we know about cities in Yoruba land, for instance. Doesn't mean that there is no city walls in Yoruba land. Of course, there are many and everywhere, right? But they might not be as old as this history we are talking about. They might rather be the process of fragmentation, of political fragmentation, which occurred later, and I'm going to come back to that. This is a little article I wrote a couple of years back, kind of trying to rethink about the city in tropical Africa, and especially Ife as a major urban center. Now, one problem that we have at Ife, which is a major problem, is the chronology of Ife, right? So we all know about the traditional narrative about Ife, that Ife is the origin of the world, and that Ife has existed from the beginning of the world until today. Well, the archaeology is telling us something slightly different. And I want to show you a couple of these images. This is actually, you can see in the black and white photograph is a photograph taken from the archives of Frank Willett. Frank Willett excavated across the city wall at Itayemu. And we also excavated across the city wall at Itayemu, just next to the trench made by Frank Willett. And what we discovered is, you see this pavement here, which is the same as here. And then as Willett has found something he called humus, which is this kind of dark earth layer, we also found it. And when you look at radiocarbon dates, so when we extract radiocarbon dates from this context, you can see that everything underneath the pavement, underneath this dark level, is actually before the 14th century, from the 11th to the 14th century. But then dates from the dark level comes out from the 17th, 18th century, and then the bank here is built in the 19th century. So there is an issue at Ife, which is about this earth. So this is another city wall at Okeatan, right? And we find the same black soil on the top of early sediments, separating what is medieval from what is modern. I hope you see it well enough on your screen. This is Oduduwa College, and of course, we see exactly the same thing, sorry. You see this black level running throughout the units. Underneath, pre-14th century. On the top of it, post-17th century. What happened between the end of the 14th century and the early 17th century? What is this level of dark earth telling us? And here, very interesting pictures that we took from units we excavated at Oduduwa. Once again, here you see a pavement, and here you see an ancient pit, right? And you can see the black soil running into the pit, right? And the same thing here. Here the remains of what was possibly a wall, and then this black soil running through like a liquid almost inside that space. And then you can see that it is layered. What is this? So we used the expertise of some soil scientists. They are here on the slide, and each one has a very specific field. They are not studying the same thing, but altogether they came with some very interesting hypothesis, which say that the dark color actually doesn't come from organic matter, which was my first option. I thought, oh, there's a lot of charcoal in these layers. No, there is no more charcoal than in other parts of the archaeological record. Maybe it's from manganese. But what is really interesting is that from the granulometric and micromorphological studies that they did on samples that we collected, they recognized the fact that this sediment, these layers resulted from the action of water. possibly flood. So what does it tell us? Well, it tells us that at the end of the 14th century, something happened at Ife, something probably quite dramatic. And was a lot of rainfall, and the rainfall was moving sediments around, and people were not cleaning the sediments any longer because maybe people had left the city of Ife. Another very interesting clue of that crisis is found still at Oduduwa College with the remains of a child. Actually, what is remaining from this child was just a few teeth, but the few teeth in place coming out of a skull. And this was not a grave. This child had died on the surface, on the living surface of this city at some point in the 14th century. And close to him were these beads, all right, which were still organized as a kind of a necklace. And we think that these were actually beads that were worn by this child. How this child died, we do not know, but it's a fact that a child died on the surface, on the living surface of this compound somewhere in the 14th century, and it's not normal. This child did not receive a burial. Let's talk about burial. Couple of years back, and built on what I told you at the beginning about the crisis of the 14th century, I started bringing some historians together to reflect on the reason why we never talked about the second plague pandemic in Africa. Why was the old world affected by a pandemic which we know was connected with trade and with the circulation of cereals and people and goods from Asia to Western Europe and North Africa? Why were we not talking about this possible pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa? Maybe there was never the plague pandemic, the second plague pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe. But maybe there was, and nobody really cared about it because there was no written record of it, because it's sub-Saharan Africa, and written record for that period are scarce. So we started developing studies around that question, and I looked at it generally. We had archaeologists working in Burkina Faso that actually reflected on their own archaeological sites. We had Marie-Laure Dora, who works in Ethiopia, and Monica Green, who actually is an historian of public health and the Black Death in particular. And altogether, we came to realize that there were actually quite a number of evidence that these deadly pandemics also affected sub-Saharan Africa and probably disorganized some of the societies that existed prior to the expansion of this pandemic in the area. But it did not last as long as it lasted in the Western world for some environmental questions that I can't discuss here, especially in West Africa. Although in East Africa, you still have descendants from the bacteria which evolved from the medieval bacteria, which still is to be found in the environment in Eastern Africa, not in West Africa. So this is an hypothesis, and we are not able to prove it right now. That's why it's a working hypothesis that maybe the reason why we found this child on the living surface, maybe the reason why people stopped cleaning their compound and the rain took the mud around this beautiful city is that the city was affected by these pandemics. Been talking a lot about that, and recently with an anthropologist specialized in mortuary archaeology, and then of course my colleague Ogun Folakan, we wrote an article trying to review all evidence about burials in the southwestern Nigeria. And basically, we find that there are several evidences actually of, especially at Ife, but also elsewhere, of people, of human remains on living surfaces belonging to the 14th century. And we also have this fantastic Benin City mass grave that also dates from the 14th century, which also we discuss in this article. I'm not going to go in depth here because it will, I've already used quite some of your time. But let's say that this is the only known mass grave in West Africa for the 14th century. It was found 17.5 meters below the surface by a crazy archaeologist called Kona, which is dead now, but before he died, he was telling me how crazy he was as a young man to dig that deep. And interestingly, the same archaeologists who found this thought that these were evidence of human sacrifices, but there is no evidence of violence on these bones. And we restudied all these bones, which are stored at the University of Ibadan, and there is no evidence of human sacrifice, of violence on these bones. These people did not die out of violence. They did not die out of human sacrifice that will leave some traces on the bones. They might have died from a disease. There were about 40 individuals in this mass grave, mostly female, because this was found within the periphery of the palace of Benin City, and probably in the area where women actually lived in the palace. So these were mostly women. Well, so this is the scenario that we are kind of putting together, which says that, well, something happened at Ile-Ife. We can say it because of the archaeological remains. We don't exactly know what it is. We have hypotheses, we put scenarios together, but definitively there is a collapse of Ife during the second half of the 14th century. And we think that survivors of this crisis fled away from Ife to different parts of southwestern Nigeria and possibly even beyond that. And we have evidence of flooding, of rains, of heavy rains, and so on. And so the question now is there anything about this in the oral traditions of Ife? And of course, I am not a specialist of Ife's oral tradition. Don't ask me about my skills in Yoruba. They are very, very bad. I hardly speak English, so Yoruba is even another level. But still, we think that what we found in Ife really changes everything because we are actually able to connect these archaeological findings to some of the oral traditions. But before I get there, let me say that this new perspective about Ife and this crisis in the 14th century kind of questions a lot of the orthodoxy about the enduring medieval culture paradigms that I was talking earlier about, and which has been developed by very bright scholars, which I really love by the way, like Biorun or Blier. But I think that they missed something in the history of Ife, which, if replaced at the right place, at the right center, tells a kind of a different story about these objects and about Ife per se. This is shrine number 2. It was excavated at Itayemu by Frank Willett in 1962-1963. You see, you can see the pavement and you can see these ritual objects that have fallen onto the pavement. They are really objects left in situ. What does that mean? We know that in the period of Old Ife, shrines were actually made of little shelters using vegetation. They were like small tables, small wooden tables onto which these objects were, these probably ancestral objects used for ancestral worships were deposited. And sometimes there was a building around them. And we can see that we find these objects today in situ, which means that when people left Ile-Ife, they left them behind. And the vegetation gradually rotted, and these things fell onto the pavement. And gradually the walls around them also eroded away and fell. And then rain brought some sediments onto it and buried them. A lot of the prestige objects that we found were actually found in this type of context. And we have evidence of holding, like, for instance, the found at Wunmonije compound in 1938, where we have almost all the bronze heads that we know of Ife brought together, right? Like if someone tried to bring all these precious objects together and hide them before leaving the city, hoping they would come back, but never coming back. Of course, we also have the question of the technological collapse. You probably have heard, and if you don't know him, I suggest you really read him because he's a fantastic archaeologist, Babatunde Babalola, who has proven and who has published a lot of material on the making of glass beads in ancient Ife. And we know that this technology actually, which had existed for several centuries, suddenly collapsed in the 14th century, and there is no successor. Successors are going to be glass beads brought by Europeans through the Atlantic trade. Why do you think Europeans brought glass beads to Nigeria as early as the 15th century? Because there was a high demand in glass beads because people had lost the secret of making them. They were still recycling the old glass beads, which were basically mined which the reason why in Portuguese they were called terracotta. They say terra da conta, which means that they were objects found underground because they were mined by people to recycle these ancient beads, but they had lost the secret of the glass bead industry. Now, how does that connect us to the oral tradition? Can we find evidence of this crisis, this catastrophic event, let's say, in Ife traditions that would preserve the memory of an exodus out of Ife? Of course we do. This is the story of the departure of the 16 sons of Oduduwa to found new kingdoms. And of course, in Ife tradition, you have mentions of the catastrophic flood, which were survived by the 16 sons of Oduduwa. And actually, I believe that Oduduwa is a term that encapsulates Old Ife, the sons of Old Ife. Oduduwa is actually Old Ife, I believe. This is the story of aristocratic lineages leaving Ife and carving for themselves new polities outside of Ife by carrying with them the Ife memories and traditions and name. So there is actually a lot in oral traditions that are about the transformation of the Ife into a diaspora, connected together with memory, kingship, belief system, and maybe the call to Ogun, for instance, might have been as going back at the original Oduduwa Ife. So I'm almost getting close to the end now, but I want to reflect a little bit on the Ife diaspora, and that's why our project is called Ife Shumbo, because we also excavated in close to Lagos the famous Shumbo Zeredo, which was an early city wall, or rather territorial walls, that was marking the limits of the very early city-state of Ijebu Ode. We were able to date Shumbo Zeredo to the first half of the 15th century. Well, we have several dates that are going from the very end of the 14th century to the middle of the first half of the 15th century, right? So it means that Shumbo Zeredo was built after Ijebu became one of the polities taken over by the Ife diaspora, at least in terms of its kingship. I have a very bright student, Lasisi Olanrewaju, who did his PhD on Ijebu, and it's incredible actually that you can still find at Ijebu through a study of rituals that takes place there, this kind of conflict between the autochthonous population and the diaspora coming from Ife, leading eventually to an agreement about sharing power at Ijebu. This is quite interesting because it tells us something about what happened after Ife collapsed. And that's the scenario that I'm going to, bring to you. Once again, it's a scenario, all right? I'm not saying that I detain the truth, and I'm not saying that I know it all. It would be too easy. But from what we study, we kind of see that the fall of Ife led to a process of political fragmentation in the region between rival city-states. And at the same time that Ijebu is building his embankment, Benin City also built its embankments around the city. We have dates for that from Kona, same dates. So about 2 or 3 generations before the opening of the Atlantic trade and the arrival of the Europeans, you had a very different political mosaic that had existed earlier, right? How this fragmentation in the region played out with the opening of the Atlantic trade. These are really fascinating questions for historians to explore. Now, of course, Ife was resettled, and this is a little hidden gap in the history, the traditional history of Ife, which is difficult to study because nobody says that Ife was went through this crisis and that the population left and then came back. And therefore, this is an area which is still very, very muddy in terms of the history of Ife. As I said, we have evidences. We have this clear break in the archaeological records. We have no archaeological evidence for the 15th, 16th century at Ife. We have also a change in ceramic between the lower horizons and then upper horizons. Very different ceramic in terms of the designs. So definitively people came back to Ife. Why would they have resettled Ife? Well, probably because Ife was not forgotten, and then probably because at a certain point it had to play a role in the regional politics, and maybe it marked a resistance against the emergence of the new imperial power at Oyo. Once again, these are open to discussions, really. Now, what about the rediscovery of the lost art of Ife? Why do we have names for all these objects? Well, actually, most of these objects that we find in modern Ife were rediscovered by the people who resettled Ife as they were farming. They stumbled upon some of these olokun heads and other beautiful objects. Oftentimes, they saw it as a sign of that was like a spiritual sign, and they created sacred groves around this place, which was the case of Itayemu. Itayemu was a sacred grove in the 19th century until the colonial period during the early 20th century. So objects of old Ife were reintegrated in the belief system and in the social system of those who came after, from the 17th century up to today. And they were reintegrated, all right? And the history of Ife was reabsorbed by the new settlers, all right, in a very interesting way. And of course, this process was reinforced in the 20th century, especially through the role played by these 3 men in bringing the name of Ife to the top again, right? And I of course, could not avoid a little joke of making Ife great again. But it's really interesting to see the Oni Aderemi, for instance, working very closely with Willett and with other archaeologists, and kind of reincorporating this history into the traditional history of Ife as it came in, right? And finding meaning, new meanings to the objects and new meanings to the sites that fit into the story of an Ife which would have existed forever and would have never been going through a crisis. So this is also, important for us, interested in heritage, in history, to understand that history, of course, is also highly political, right? And that the work of the archaeologists, the work of the historians, all right, is constantly used, all right, as items in local politics to reinforce power of the elite. And I think that something like that also happened at Ife. Doesn't mean that Ife was not great, you understand? It's really rather interesting to see how the research, all right, fits in and is used, all right, in bringing back the memory and power of this very powerful ancient city to make it relevant in 20th century and 21st century Nigeria. So I'm done for this evening. I hope I did not talk too long. I hope you enjoyed a lot of the little hypotheses and teasing that I gave you tonight. I want to emphasize the fact that this work is not my work; it's a teamwork. Very important. You see here on the picture here, my good friend. Adisa Ogunfolakan, Joseph Ayodokun, my colleague Neil Norman, our new student at William and Mary, Ore, and all the participants into the last season of the archaeological project. And of course, we don't do it also alone. We do it because we get some support and sponsors, and we are looking for more. Especially, we are looking for support from Nigeria and not only support from international agencies. Thank you very much.
Prof, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think we're giving you our own individual rounds of applause offline that you can't hear. You're right, you've been talking for long, but do you mind just us detaining you a little bit longer with a few questions? Are you able to answer some questions for us?
Of course.
Fantastic. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to chair this question section, and I will begin with maybe chair's prerogative of asking myself. There are some in the chat that I'll ask, then let you answer those ones, and then we'll come back for a second round. Please, if you have a question, you raise your hand or you type it in the chat, and that's how we'll see. So, well, let me, while everyone is composing their thoughts, let me start with a couple of mine and then go to the ones that people have posted during your presentation. So first is to say it's lovely to have an archaeology presentation, because before I got seduced sideways into anthropology and environment issues, I started out as and it was archaeology that brought me to West Africa. So it's really nice to get back into the headspace. Thank you. Two questions about what we're talking about and we know. So, some of the evidence you show us obviously invites this alternative thesis, which comes to the front of your mind in these days of climate change, that what if instead of being a disease event overtaken by flooding, we actually talk about extreme weather incidents that made the place uninhabitable? And what would you think of that as an alternative interpretation of some of the same evidence? That's one. Mm-hmm. The other one is, globally, archaeological excavations and discoveries happen in two ways. One is people doing what you're doing, is to set out and do a research project and decide where to investigate. But the other one, which happens increasingly and has led to some of the most amazing archaeological discoveries, is archaeology at the frontier of development. As cities grow, as roads are built, as infrastructure is built, what people throw up. And it's amazing to see what's going on in Nigerian archaeology lately, a real renaissance of archaeology in Nigeria, and amazing stuff that's being done intentionally. But I wonder if you can speak to what you've been able to do, if anything, about archaeology in the course of development, whether it's property developers developing things in Ife, whether it's citizen science and asking people about what's in their own backyard, how it's been possible to go beyond the frontiers of professional archaeology and get other people to start contributing data, instead of just destroying things as they put in pipes or bridges. So those are my two. From the chat, there are three. One is, does anybody, I guess this isn't just a question for you, Prof, but everybody, is if there's an actual accurate translation into English of the word Sungbo. Secondly is, what do you think of the use of AI to further enhance archaeology at this landscape level in Ife or Nigeria as a whole? And third, how do you think your kind of research findings can drive community appreciation of heritage treasure, especially in an era when, land is this huge asset that people want to monetize? So, how does that revalue and maybe aid in the cause of preservation? So I'll give you those ones. That's plenty to be thinking of, and then come back to see what else has been put. Thank you.
All right. So I put in my camera, if you don't mind, so that you can see also the distress on my face as I'm trying to reply to these questions. Well, let me start with the environmental questions and change. Definitively, and this is something that is, becoming very clear in many parts of the world. This crisis from the 14th century is not just a crisis which is a pandemic, but it's a crisis that is connected with environmental change. And it's not for nothing that I mention evidence of very heavy rains during that period of a crisis, of an assumed crisis at Ife, which is something also we see in the context of the mass burial at Benin City. We can see that before the mass burial, there was quite some rain, then the mass burial, then a lot of rain following the mass burial. And we can see that because this well recorded fine layers of sand and clay, which was brought into the pit by running water on the surface. So this is a little bit of a problem, because for this period of time, most people is actually convinced that this was actually a very dry period, right? And it can be a very dry period with very disastrous episodes of rains. So the environmental question is something that we are actually investigating. We have a team of 3 environmental archaeologists in our team, and they did actually sampling this year in 2025 in the various marshy areas in Ife. And it's going to take some time, but eventually we are going to get a picture of environmental change at Ife, which might or might not bring some answers to the questions we have about the history of Ife. Now, archaeology, at the frontier of the development world, I guess you are talking about, and this is actually kind of connected with the last question about how we drive community appreciation. Well, these are difficult questions, all right, especially in an environment like Ife, where we know there is a lot of issues with gold mining right now. Seeing archaeologists, sometimes we use heavy equipment, seeing archaeologists with heavy equipment doing holes can actually bring a lot of questions and a lot of animosity, I must say. And a lot of what we do is to kind of do community work to explain, first of all, that we are now looking for gold. Secondly, that we are an archaeologist. We try to explain the concept of what archaeology is, which is not so easy to understand, really. And we try to embark people into some of the research work. And one example of that is the work we did with the pavement. As part of the project, we did a survey, a surface survey of pavements throughout Ile-Ife. And so we came into contact, the teams of Nigerian archaeologists and anthropologists who did that work did a lot of work with communities, explaining what was going on, what were these pavements, trying to bring the sense that these pavements are important, they are traces of the past. And actually, usually, the response of people is fairly good. You must have realized in my presentation that we do not dig wherever we want to dig. We dig where we think it's possible to dig. So we dig on federal land, annex of the museum. We dig in schools with the agreement of the Department of Education. We dig in a private property that belongs to one of us, right? Lujumo, for the Ogunfolakam family. We dig where we are invited, and that's the Edunide family invited us to study their compound and the archaeological remains they left behind. And then sometimes we try to dig in places where that we think has a lot of potential. This is Lugbade. And Lugbade, we had to go through a long process of meeting with the family, explaining what we were doing. And that was also probably the most difficult excavation we did, because it was on the side road, it was open, and everyone passing, could make his own mind about what we were doing. A very interesting excavation, but also probably one of the most difficult one. So we do a lot of community work, but despite that, what we do is still very intellectual. That's the reason why we decided to build the Interpretation Center at Itayemi. Something tangible for once, right? Not just words and promises, but something tangible, with the idea that this will become a place where people will be able to see the past physically, a place that will be open to schools, a place that will be used to educate communities about what they see everywhere around their compound but do not understand, and maybe to encourage them to respect these places and maybe build around instead of going through them, and report them and have them document them. So I think as archaeologists, we are limited in some ways in what we can bring to communities, unfortunately. We don't have much to bring except, this intellectual I would say outreach, and this different view of looking at the history from what people left behind. And it's quite unique, but we would never be able to satisfy everybody or make everybody happy with that, right? Also, archaeology is an expensive discipline. And, this also brings a lot of ethical issues in terms of, the amount of money that we spend in doing what we do, right? sometimes in the middle of fairly deprived community, sorry. There is also the issue of, the colonial heritage in archaeology. For a very long time, archaeology has been led by white men, right, in Nigeria. And in some ways, all right, we are still a couple of white men working there, and people can see that also as a form of neocolonialism, although we actually are not, I think, because we don't decide. We are working as teams with many other Nigerian scholars, right? And we make it as something really important for what we do. So we don't really only respond to questions we want to ask, but we also listen to questions, that are important for Nigerian communities. There is some questions about the technology and AI, for instance. AI would, there is no way we are going to escape AI in the next month and years, right? At the rate it goes. So we better start thinking about how we can, take advantage of AI, what AI can learn from models that could really help us developing some models for what we do. I think it's very promising, but we need to have people trained in that particular field and in archaeology to really being able to make use of AI in a way that will make a difference. I'm not sure we still have that, at least in Nigeria, even in most places, but it's going to come because AI is going to be the unescapable truth and reality. And so archaeologists are going to seize it as they have been seizing photography and photogrammetry and LiDAR. Let me say that we did a LiDAR survey on Chumbo-Zeredo a few years back, and we are still processing this data, which is absolutely huge. So we are very interested in technology and looking at bare earth below the vegetation was a huge opportunity for us and still is a huge opportunity. And now we have colleagues in Calabar and colleagues in Benin City who actually want to duplicate this type of studies to look at earthworks, early earthworks in the Eshan and Benin areas, or in the Calabar area. So it's very promising technology, lots of very promising technology. I think I must have missed a lot of questions. Chumbo. There was a question about Chumbo, but I don't remember what it was. If there is a term for Chumbo?
Let me recap that question and also add the other ones that have been posted since. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the question on Chumbo was if there's a kind of accurate translation into English that captures it. Then I give you some of the other ones. One is, how do you surmise that Oduduwa has 16 children? What are their names? If that's not what comes to mind, maybe you go and direct us to what we read to find out and the source that you use. The other question about Chumbo is there any archaeological evidence that gives insight as to the living conditions, the modes of life that people had there? You talked a bit about in Ife, but in terms of that side, in Ijebode. And then, well, the one on technology we already had, really. What are a few challenges in the course of your work, considering the limitations you have in places you can dig? I guess you'll always have a partial picture based on where you can dig. Can you imagine into the space about the things that you can't know that are kind of frustrating that you'd love to? I think, and then we close the questions there and give way for the votes of thanks. By the way, Dr. Kimbo, thank you very much for putting all these questions in the chat in a very neat way. You've helped me a lot. So if you can give us your response, Prof, and then we close.
So there's no English translations for Chumbo because Chumbo is supposed to be a name, the name of a lady, of a very wealthy and powerful lady who is said to have built that particular earthworks. around Ijebu. So there is no English translations for that term, right? But it's a really interesting story. A lot have been written about Chumbozeredo and a lot of discussions about what these earthworks were. I think we are coming close to understand what they stand for and why they were built and how they were built. But there is still a lot of work to be done. But what is really interesting is that everywhere in across Yoruba land, there is these stories about these very powerful women of the past. And I believe that this has something to say about some kind of political order where women played a role, maybe more important role that they played in the later history of Yoruba land. So we need to kind of pay attention to these stories with these very powerful women. The 16 children, I think the 16 children, this is a metaphor, right? It doesn't mean that there were really 16 persons that left. I think there might have been more on that, because if you look at the landscape at Ife, around Ife and in Yoruba land and up to Togo and Benin, you have a lot of settlements that are, and even in Ghana, right? We have a lot of settlements that we are told were made by people who left Ife. So the term 16, right, is a kind of a magical, is a kind of spiritual, is a kind of metaphorical number, which doesn't need to be taken, for what it is. Now, in terms of the life of Ife, so one of the major ways for archaeologists to reconstruct ways of life is to look at trash left behind, to look at burials. At Ife, there has never been any burial found or excavated so far that belongs to that early period, right? So there's been human remains found, but never in burials. So this probably tells us something that we don't really understand very well about funerary practices during that period that were different from the one we know or the one that became relevant in the later centuries. But we are also missing then this opportunity to know more about the people of Ife with what they would have brought with them in the grave, right? Although it's always a little bit borderline to excavate burials. So I have always been quite satisfied from the fact that we did not find burials at Ife, because it also, brings a lot of ethical questions. Now, we have a lot of trash pits. And out of these trash pits, we were able to, as I demonstrated, to look at the fact that people were very industrious. Actually, Ife was a very industrial city. The main production was, of course, glass. And we have a lot of pollutants coming from the glass industry that we retrieve in the archaeological record. We also have pollutants coming from the work of copper, which means that copper was also worked at Ife, although we have never found any workshop for that particular activity. And we also know that there was quite some metal, some iron smelting work around Ife and at Ife, probably because we also found pollutants associated with that industry. So lots of industry associated with the mastering of fire. Of course, pottery, which is one of the reasons why potched pavements existed, right? Because the city consumed a very large amount of ceramics. We also know, of course, about some of the food waste because we retrieve some of the cereals and the grains that people ate. Not all. We have a partial view. And to talk about so we have a very partial view still of the way of life of people at Ife. And of course, in that particular field, we need to work with art historians to kind of say also what art history, what the art left behind by the people of Ife tell us about their way of lives. For instance, I told you about shrine, how the shrine looked like. We know how the shrine looked like because we have one representation of a shrine on a pot that was retrieved by Garlick in 1951. Sorry, 71. So you see, art history, archaeology, we all come together to try to thicken the plot, but we will always have gaps, all right? And you were talking about the strategy we use. I talked a little bit about that. These are strategies that are based not on where we would like to excavate, but where we think we can excavate without creating problem for the community. And of course, therefore, everything we do is partial, but this is what history is about. There is nothing like a total history. History, even the one you make from the archives themselves are a selection of text, all right? You don't have access to all. You never have access to all. History is fractal, is made of fragments. And so you try as much as possible to bring some fragments, all right, to occupy the space with a few fragments of the past. And you talk about this as the past, but it's not exactly the past.
Prof, thanks a lot. That's a very philosophical note to end. And it gives us food for thought in our practice as heritage practitioners. I've just noticed Mrs. Kofo-Adeleke has a hand up. So before handing back to Dr. Akimbo for vote of thanks. And by the way, I've just noticed also, we started with 41 participants. We have 39. So even though we've been on for nearly 2 hours, it's a testament to how interested everybody's been that we've lost precisely 2 people. So Mrs. Adeleke, let's hear from you, and then Dr. Akimbo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, an absolutely excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I did ask the question about Sungbo, and I think you've answered it in a way in the presentation, because I could see that there is actually a link between Sungbo Zeredo in Lagos up to Ife. So I think, as you said, we need to learn more about the role of women, the role that they played. But the question that I really have for you is something that you said at the very beginning of the presentation. You mentioned that one of the problems is that Africa tends to be left out in books, especially books that refer to periods before the 18th century. And I think later on you mentioned Jacob Olupeno, who said that it's not because of lack of content, it's because of lack of interdisciplinary discourse. So and I also find it very frustrating when you read books about the early period and Africa is not mentioned. And as you said, there was trade going on between Ife and Asia in the medieval period, things that are not recorded. And so the question now is, how can we change this? I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about is that, okay, we have Ife, which is a very important center, and there are hundreds of archaeological associations around the world, conferences and symposiums. I mean, maybe we should try to bring them more to Africa to actually have their conferences and activities. So I don't know what ideas you have about how all of us can start doing things to change this so that Africa's pre-colonial history is mentioned along with other histories in the earlier periods. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is indeed, I think you said it all. To be frank with you, this is, something people like scholars like me who are interested in the earlier period have been lamenting for a very long time. I think in the United States, if I have, let's say, 10 colleagues that are really doing something similar as historians, compare with thousands and thousands and thousands of historians of contemporary Africa, right? That's tells you something about the fact that we are still, we are still inheriting from this narrative about an Africa which history would be, out of reach and blah blah blah. So there is a problem. I think Africans have the solution in their hands. Unfortunately, most of the African graduates in history are doing colonial and post-colonial history. And I very much understand why, because it's much easier to have access to these archives than to delve into this very complicated, complex, sometimes expensive endeavor of looking for the earlier history. But that's when also maybe institutions and fundings, could play a role in strengthening a little bit the balance. Right now, there is almost no historians trained in pre-Atlantic, what we call oftentimes in a very bad way, pre-colonial history, let's say pre-18th century history. Most of the positions are occupied by archaeologists. And they are the only one, especially historical archaeologists, who are actually filling these positions. And these positions are not many; they are actually very few. So we have a problem, and organization can your own and institutions in Africa, should be thinking about how to solve this problem. Yeah, so we have actually the Pan-African Archaeological Congress that takes place every 2 years in Africa. And we have the Society of African Archaeology, who takes place outside of Africa every 2 years. So they kind of complement each other in many ways. In a few days, we would have the West African Association of Archaeologists that would have its conference at the University of Ibadan. So we have actually, events, and Nigeria is very ahead in terms of the archaeology in West Africa, I must say. There is only one university in Ghana that produces archaeologists, right? And there are at least 4 or 5 now in Nigeria that do. So, and we have, a very good number of graduates that are participating to our work and to other international, and they are very successful also internationally in terms of getting grants and training themselves. So I'm hoping that some of these, although they are archaeologists, might be developing broad enough, kind of an understanding of the historiography of Africa to occupy some of these positions, maybe even to create new positions around the earlier history of Africa.
Okay, thank you so much for this, Prof. You've been speaking for close to 2 hours straight up, and it's been quite illuminating lecture, and it actually opens a new vista to the way we think, especially in terms of history, African history or West African history before colonialization. I think there's the perception that history starts with the colonial period, but no, with the contact I'll call it pre-contact. History started after contact, but there's a lot of history beyond, and your techniques is opening a veil that has long eluded us. Very interesting the way you are able to link oral tradition with the tools archaeology brings. With that, before we let you go and then we do the vote of thanks, I would like to make 1 or 2 comments or questions. With what we have in terms of the flood, the trade route, the Black Death, which I have never even thought out, it's also interesting that we have Ife, Benin, and Igbo Iku, 3 archaeologically rich areas. I would like to know whether there are the 2 we haven't talked about at all, DNA. Why is there, and the major tool in archaeology worldwide, why when we talk about Africa, I know they say the climate is quite hostile towards preserving DNA, but why isn't it used at all in terms of archaeology? And especially when we have to pierce a period beyond any written record. Thank you.
That's a great question. And I can talk to this question because I actually tried to extract DNA from the material I talked about from Benin City, which is stored at the University of Ibadan. And and not only I did that, but I did a collect from human remains from a number of sites that people shared with me. All these were sent to a lab in Canada and in California for extraction, and they all came back blank. So there is a problem, which is an environmental problem with DNA in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a problem that maybe future technology will solve, right? But right now, with the technology we use and with what we know about DNA, we are not very successful in extracting DNA from human remains from sub-Saharan Africa, probably because, as you know, sub-Saharan Africa is mostly some old geological context, which are very granitic and very acidic. And it seems that in this environment, the DNA does not do very well and degrades quite quickly. There's been a number of experiments done, even with contemporary remains, which shows that these environments are not very good for recovering DNA. So we need to look for environments which are in a sedimentary context. Most of what the work I've done in West Africa, in Ghana, in Nigeria, were not sedimentary context at all. They were rather, as I said, the old granitic rock. This being said, as I said, a problem that exists today might be solved tomorrow. Maybe a different approach to recovering DNA, maybe a different way of accessing informations that is carried by DNA might be possible. There is a lot of people right now, for instance, who do environmental DNA, where they basically look for all kinds of traces of DNA in, for instance, a trash pit to know, okay, what kind of food was there, what kind of remains were there that have disappeared. So there is techniques coming out every day. Maybe tomorrow we will be able to solve this issue, but right now we are a bit limited, and that's why the amount of data from sub-Saharan Africa in terms of ancient DNA is fairly thin. I was actually, and it is ancient DNA that has solved the Black Death issue in Europe. For a very long time in Europe, people were fighting over what kind of disease was really that disease. Many people thought it was not plague. and it's ancient DNA that solved the riddle, and now everybody knows it's plague. And so DNA might have been able to solve this riddle in sub-Saharan Africa if we did not have that very specific environmental issue. I tried and I failed.
Thank you so much for such touching answer. So Dr. Akibo, please, you have the floor. Doctor, for whatever reason we can't hear you, check whether you need to unmute yourself. He also serves as our tech support. So if he's having problem, it means it's a serious problem.
I can see that he's unmuted.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, you can.
Perfect, sir.
Sorry, I was multitasking. My apologies, my sincere apologies. Okay, so first and foremost, I want to appreciate everyone. Like I said before now, as a village boy, I recognize people as either prof, doctor, or oga, because I believe everyone, one way or the other, has a form of heritage and a beauty behind him or herself that we need to respect. I recognize those here, first of all, our speaker, Professor Gerald Choin, for your wonderful presentation. I'm still going to take like 5 or 6 minutes of your time. I recognize those within the gallery, so to say, the Amarachis, the Ajayi Obeys, the Jayi Obas, the Oyedirons, the Aleru, the Adelekes, the Akiolugbades, the Animashan, the Deyaolu, the Ojumus, the Ayodokuns, the Alis, of course. My powerful president, the Baloguns, the Akures, I recognize every single one of you. But before we leave here today, I say to you, Nigeria recognizes everyone in this room, and Legacy, especially the host organization, says you need to know more about what we do at Legacy 1995 NG. We are the Historical and Environmental Interest Group of Nigeria. We're a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting and preserving Nigeria's cultural heritage. Established in 1995, we have operated a membership organization, voluntary run entity, uniting people passionate about conservative historic monuments, cultural entities, and the environment across the country. Our commitment to heritage is evident by our direct involvement in restoration, research, and public awareness. Get to see more of this by going to our YouTube, or simply go to tv.legacy1995.ng. It's see all our pictures and our videos on our flagship website. Our achievement in the restoration of Jeke House in the historic railway compound in Ebute Metta is just one of many. We have many ongoing projects as we speak to you. We are a colonial, let me quickly refer to Jeke House. It's a colonial era building, for those who know about it, which now serves as the Legacy Secretariat and a mini museum with a powerful garden and a symbol of our work. We intend to do more. Legacy 1995 actively organizes historical tours, exhibitions, and webinars to educate both adults and thousands of Nigerians, and because we have 1 or 2 persons outside Nigeria who have joined us on the invitation of one of us right here in this room. And moving forward, documentation is we're able to pass enough information for those that we know and for those that we do not know. For example, Professor Gerald has enlightened us on some areas and even given us some recommendations based on the questions of one of our members on what we need to do, and we intend to do that. We have a publication of the historical sites of Nigerian map. We will still ensure that it is updated and made available to the general public. Our effort in involving and collaborating with government agencies like the Nigerian Commission for Museums and Monuments recently, before they launched the museum.ng, which many of us can go to. Excuse me. And finally, Our reflected, persistent, and proactive approach to ensuring that you and I gain more information with this academic webinar. This is the second of its kind in this year, and we intend to do more of this. We want to invite the academia to please partner with Legacy. We are here, we love you, we appreciate you. And as we wrap up today's event, I tell you this, and I kid you not, our 2 hours, 3 minutes was spent beautifully well with someone in the leadership, with someone in the academic seat, and with you and I participating in our role. I want to once again say thank you so much and stay tuned. On that note, I yield the floor to the General House to say a big thank you to Gerald Choi. Thank you, sir. We appreciate you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Oluyori, for also being present here today.
I was expecting the thank you in different languages. You know, Professor Gerald said something. He said, don't ask me to speak Yoruba. Even though one of the questions, taunted him to, say something in Yoruba language.
Thank you, Gerard, for the beautiful presentation.
Brilliant presentation.
Nagode. Okay, so we will be shutting down our recording in the next 1 minute, which is 60 seconds from now. And we appreciate all the over 40 persons who stayed on. Passion.
Can we have this recorded version?
Yes, that's why we say we'll be shutting down the recording in the next 30 seconds so that we can all have our sound recorded on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
For the presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.